What began as a simple 911 call from a frightened child quickly unraveled into a chilling investigation that no one expected. A trusted healer was secretly endangering children, leaving families trapped in a cycle of fear and dependency. This is the story of how one officer's instincts, a mother's courage, and a community's vigilance exposed the truth and saved lives. It begins on an ordinary night at the emergency call center. A veteran dispatcher scrolls through routine reports when the line opens to something different. A child's voice. Not a panicked shout, not a scream, just a whisper, each word trembling. He said it only hurts the first time. The operator leans closer to her headset. This isn't an ordinary misdial. Children don't invent words like that out of nowhere. She asks carefully, "Can you tell me your name? Where are you right now?" The reply is hesitant, barely audible. Nora. A street name follows, broken, unsure, but it's enough to lock onto. Protocol takes over. Units are dispatched, but something about the tone lingers. It's the kind of call that forces even the most experienced to sit up straighter. Officer Daniel Wyatt was not the fastest in the precinct, not the loudest, but he was the one they called when instinct was needed. At 53, with decades of cases behind him, he understood patterns. He understood silence. When the report of a suspicious 911 call from a child landed on the screen, Daniel didn't hesitate. He closed his file, grabbed his keys, and drove toward Oak Ridge Heights, a quiet stretch of homes where every window carried its own story. The dispatcher replayed the child's words for him en route. 7 words, spoken without context. 7 words that carried enough weight to change his night, and maybe much more. The house was small, 2 bedrooms, blue paint peeling from the siding. The lawn was neatly kept, hedges trimmed. Outwardly, nothing suggested chaos. Wyatt knocked. The door opened to a young woman, mid-30s, in a polo shirt with a coffee shop logo. Her name was Gina. Her eyes showed exhaustion, the kind that accumulates not from one bad night, but from years of too many shifts and not enough help. She blinked at the badge. "A call? There must be some mistake. It's just me and my daughter here." Wyatt didn't argue. He asked politely if he could step inside just to make sure. Reluctance flickered across her face, but she stepped aside. The living room was tidy. A worn couch, mismatched chairs, but the walls were covered in a child's drawings. A calendar pinned with overlapping work shifts. Bills stacked in a corner. It didn't look neglected. It looked stretched thin. "Is your daughter here?" Wyatt asked. Gina nodded. "She's in her room. She hasn't been feeling well lately." And as if summoned, the child appeared. 6-year-old Nora stood in the hallway, teddy bear pressed against her chest. Her eyes were watchful, too cautious for someone her age. What drew Wyatt's attention most wasn't her silence, or even her posture. It was the bandage wrapped around her wrist, and on the bear's arm, an identical bandage. He crouched to her level. "That's a brave bear. What's his name?" Her voice was almost a whisper. "Mr. Huggs." Wyatt nodded. "And he has the same bandage as you. Did you both get hurt?" Nora held the bear tighter. "Mr. Huggs gets the same medicine I do, so he won't be scared." The words pressed heavy against Wyatt's instincts. He didn't say it, but he had heard this before. Not these exact words, but the same pattern. Children explaining danger through play. Before Wyatt could continue, a knock came at the door. Gina opened it without hesitation. A man entered mid-30s carrying a leather bag with the confidence of someone accustomed to being welcomed. His smile was easy, his tone friendly. He introduced himself as Brian, a natural health practitioner. He set the bag down, producing small bottles, vials, packets labeled with vague promises: energy, vitality, immune support. Wyatt extended a hand. "I understand you've been helping the family." "Not medical treatment," Brian corrected smoothly. "Wellness support, holistic care, nothing invasive." From the hallway, Nora's voice cut through. "Do I need another shot today?" Brian answered quickly. "Not today, sweetheart. Just vitamins. Remember what I always say?" Nora nodded and repeated, "It only hurts the first time." The phrase, spoken so casually, landed like a warning. Wyatt excused himself and stepped outside. He called someone he trusted, Margaret Pierce, a retired child welfare specialist, still active as a volunteer. "I need your eyes on this," he said. "6-year-old girl, bandages, unlicensed treatments. Something's wrong." "I'll be there in 20 minutes, she replied. Inside, Brian continued to present his treatments to Gina, who looked at him with a kind of weary gratitude. To her, he was help she couldn't afford elsewhere. To Wyatt, he was something else entirely. Margaret's presence shifted the atmosphere. Instantly. Calm, authoritative, direct, without being harsh. She asked to see Nora's room. Inside, she observed quietly. A small desk with drawings, a trash bin with used alcohol wipes, bandages, a nightlight that felt heavier than it should. She returned to the living room. "I'm concerned," she said evenly. "Nora needs proper medical evaluation tonight." Brian tried to intercept. "I can lower her fever. I've managed it before." Wyatt stepped forward, voice firm. "Not tonight. We're going to the hospital." Brian's smile faltered. At the pediatric emergency ward, fluorescent lights replaced the dim coziness of the house. Doctors worked quickly, taking vitals, drawing blood. One doctor noted unusual marks on Nora's arms, consistent with injections. Gina admitted they were from immune shots given by Brian. Nora, given crayons to occupy her time, produced a drawing. A girl and a teddy bear, both with red dots on their arms. Above it, in uneven letters, "Medicine hurts." The paper carried more weight than any spoken testimony. Wyatt and Margaret exchanged a look. The case was no longer suspicion. It was evidence. While Nora was being stabilized, officers returned from the house with collected evidence: bottles, vials, and the nightlight. The nightlight was heavier because it wasn't a light at all. It was a hidden camera, positioned directly toward the child's bed, and at the same time word arrived, Brian was gone. Witnesses had seen him leaving with bags. The investigation had only begun. The discovery of the hidden camera changed everything. What had begun as a suspicious call was now a confirmed case of exploitation. Officers secured the evidence, sealing bags of vials, unmarked bottles, and the disguised device. Each item carried questions that demanded answers. Back at the hospital, doctors completed their first round of tests. What showed in Nora's blood was not vitamins, not anything approved by regulation. It was a mix of compounds, stimulants blended with something that weakened the immune system. The conclusion was grim. The treatments she had been given not only made her sick, but also left her body more vulnerable to further harm. Margaret stayed at the hospital with Gina, listening as the young mother struggled to reconcile what she had allowed. "He told me it was safe, that it would make her stronger. I didn't know." The guilt in her voice was thick, but Margaret reminded her gently that manipulation often wears the mask of help. Gina had wanted relief for her child, and Brian had spoken the language of promises she desperately wanted to believe. Meanwhile, Daniel Wyatt joined detectives at the precinct as they began to pull Brian's background. What emerged was a patchwork of aliases, each tied to websites offering wellness programs and home visits, none of them tied to an actual medical license. Each one hinted at more families, more children. A search warrant opened his apartment, where officers uncovered a laptop, still logged into encrypted folders. On it, spreadsheets listed dates, addresses, notes about treatment cycles, and chillingly coded phrases that investigators quickly realized referred to dosages and reactions in children. At the same time, Child Protective Services stepped in. Nora was placed in temporary supervised custody. Margaret, with her years of service, offered herself as an emergency guardian. It was a difficult decision. Gina wept as she signed the papers, but the arrangement was meant to protect while the investigation unfolded. Wyatt assured her this was not permanent, but even he knew custody battles, once opened, could drag far longer than anyone wished. Word of the case spread quickly. At the hospital, staff warned their networks. Among parents, whispers grew into phone calls. Then the media caught wind. A local station aired a press briefing. during which the police chief confirmed that the suspect was believed to have targeted more than one child. The broadcast drew out more voices. Calls poured in from families who recognized the pattern. A man offering natural remedies, a promise that injections were harmless, always framed as the beginning of a path to wellness. While police coordinated with federal agencies, Brian himself was on the move. Witnesses reported seeing him at a bus depot, buying tickets under another name. Investigators tracked his digital footprint and found that he had been preparing for expansion. A larger research center advertised through a slick but vague website. The language echoed what Gina had heard: vitality, resilience, hope. There was no mention of clinical trials, no oversight, only a promise that desperate families were often willing to risk everything to chase. By the second week, the case had shifted from a single child's protection to a multi-state hunt. FBI agents joined the operation. Wyatt, though older and technically a local officer, remained tied to the case. His instincts had been right from the start, and no one questioned his commitment. Margaret continued as Nora's anchor, visiting her daily, ensuring that the girl felt stability despite the chaos. In a closed-door meeting, Gina finally broke down the timeline of how Brian entered their lives. It had started at the coffee shop where she worked. He had overheard her talking to a co-worker about Nora's frequent colds. He had stepped in, kindly, offering advice. At first it was herbal teas, supplements she could buy over the counter. Then, after a few weeks, he offered to customize a plan specifically for Nora. The injections came later, wrapped in language about boosting immunity. He said it only hurts the first time, she recalled, shaking her head. And I believed him. I thought I was giving her a chance. Her testimony became crucial in building the case. It was not just about one man deceiving families. It was about the system of grooming, the slow erosion of trust until dependency formed. For Gina, the realization was devastating. For investigators, it was the missing piece. 2 days later, a breakthrough came. Surveillance footage from a train station showed Brian moving north toward the Canadian border. He carried 2 bags, walked with purpose, and never looked at the cameras. The image froze on the news desk in the precinct. The manhunt tightened, but alongside that image came something even more disturbing. Forensic analysts pulled files from Brian's laptop that hadn't been encrypted. Inside were photographs of children, medical notes disguised as progress logs, and a contact list of families across 3 states. 27 names in total, each one a reminder that Nora was not alone and that this was larger than anyone had feared. The alert went out across state lines, and by dawn the following day, federal agents closed in on the border crossing. Brian was intercepted at a small checkpoint, his name flagged, his photo matched against the bulletin. He tried to offer another alias, but his laptop, his bag of vials, and his silence spoke louder than anything he could say. The arrest ended. The chase, but not the story. Back at the hospital, doctors studied the mixtures he had administered. They found combinations of immunosuppressants and stimulants, substances no child should have ever received outside of controlled, legitimate medical care. The explanation for Nora's fevers, her exhaustion, and the other children's struggles became clear. The so-called treatments had been engineered not to heal, but to create dependency, sickness that only Brian's care could seem to manage. With each injection, he tightened his grip. Families were contacted one by one. Some children had only received a few treatments and were expected to recover fully. Others required long-term monitoring. A specialized medical team was assembled to undo the damage, to guide parents through the guilt and children through the fear. It was not a quick recovery, but for the first time, there was real help. For Gina and Nora, the hardest chapter was still ahead. Child Protective Services held hearings to determine custody. Margaret, having stepped in as temporary guardian, remained steady and reassuring, but Gina's fear of losing her daughter weighed on every session. She attended parenting classes, underwent evaluations, and slowly demonstrated that she had been misled, not malicious. Wyatt testified on her behalf, telling the court that she had cooperated from the moment the truth became clear. The process moved in steps. At first, Nora was allowed supervised visits with her mother, hours spent at the park under watchful eyes. Then came weekend stays. Eventually, the court ruled for full reunification, provided Margaret remained a secondary guardian for oversight. It was a balance of protection and restoration. Gina accepted it with relief. Nora adjusted with surprising resilience, learning that her world was now split between two safe homes, both committed to her well-being. In the wider community, the case left a mark. The city council passed a child health care initiative requiring stricter licensing checks for anyone advertising medical or wellness treatments for minors. Hospitals and schools launched awareness programs. Parents who once felt isolated now had support groups, built around shared vigilance and recovery. From tragedy came reform, born of necessity. 1 year later, the people who had been drawn together by one whispered phone call gathered again, not in a courtroom or a hospital, but in Margaret's modest backyard. The summer air was warm, the table set with food, laughter mingling with the sound of children playing. Nora, now healthier, ran across the yard with friends, her drawings pinned to the fence, bright, colorful scenes with no trace of illness or fear. Daniel Wyatt sat quietly, near the edge, watching her chase bubbles, her teddy bear now free of bandages. Gina joined him, gratitude unspoken but clear in her eyes. Margaret, ever composed, simply smiled. They did not need to revisit the details. They had all lived them. As the evening settled, Nora trotted over shyly with a folded piece of paper. She handed it to Officer Wyatt. Inside was a card, drawn in crayon, the letters uneven but certain. "Thank you for answering when I called." The old officer, who had trusted his instincts on one ordinary night, felt the weight of those words. Sometimes a case is paperwork, sometimes it is a headline. But sometimes it is a voice that breaks through the noise and reminds you why you listen. And with that, the story closed not with a chase, not with a trial, but with a child safe in the arms of those who chose to hear her.